So we move on to our next speaker. I've seen him in the room somewhere at the back. There he is. So if you could please welcome to the stage from Lancashire, Chief Constable Andy Rhodes.
I don't know who's teeing this music up, but you've put some thought into it, haven't you? Thanks very much. Really privileged to be invited back here today, folks. It's 2 years since I came over here and talked about the wellbeing agenda in policing, and there's a lot to report on. I'm going to talk about the story so far with the Oscar Kilo National Wellbeing Service, which is a big programme of work that has moved on significantly in the last 2 to 3 years, and I'll explain why. But more importantly, I'm going to touch on some of the issues that Serena and Michelle have talked about, where wellbeing is actually an organisational ethos. For an organisation to adopt and really embrace wellbeing as an ethos is a big, big challenge for a lot of senior leaders and line managers all the way through the organisation. That's because it requires you to think differently. It requires you to understand how people are feeling. It needs, fairness, inclusion, policy, process, resource workload. But more and more often what we see is behavioural norms needing to change to fit this agenda. And I talked about that 2 years ago, actually. So some of the things I'm going to touch upon, I think, will lead you to the conclusion that it is no surprise to me that you have got a significant success rate like that at SPNAC. And a few years ago, I talked about the first female Chief Constable, Pauline Clare. When she came to Lancashire, it was like a seismic shock in terms of things that she tried to change and did change a lot of things in Lancashire. And I was a Chief Inspector at the time, and she ran a Superintendent's Board. And I look back on it now, and I bump into Pauline every now and again at sort of civic events in Lancashire and on the train and this, that thing. And I wonder how much it took out of her being a role model and someone who's breaking the rules back in those days, because the male-dominated culture didn't take too kindly to some of the things Pauline was bringing in. One of the things she did at the Superintendent's Promotion Board was psychometric tests. And we all started talking to each other and go, oh my God, what's this? Psychometric tests. We thought, can we copy each other's? And we thought, this is what blokes sort of do. It's you can't really, if you're trying to explain your mate's inner psyche, it's even worse than trying to explain your own, And I did my psychometric test, filled it all in, oblivious to the insights this was giving Pauline when it came to the promotion interview, because the first thing she asked me, the first question was not, have you run a football match? Have you run a firearms job? All the things I thought she was going to ask me. It was, give me an example of a situation you've dealt with requiring empathy. And I sat there and I thought, this is really difficult. I was a married man with 2 children. I think if you were asked to ask my ex-wife, she'd have said that was a very good question. I wish I'd asked you before I married you, because it became blindingly obvious to Pauline and myself in that interview that I had very naturally low levels of empathy. But this actually made me, in the culture I was in, the atypical person. And I gave her an example of where I'd dealt with something with empathy, thereby demonstrating I had none natural empathy. And she looked at me over her glasses and said, clearly some work to do there, Andy. And I reminded her of this when I saw her recently at an event, and she can't even remember asking me the question, but it made a massive impact on me. And I think we really do underestimate that those questions, well placed in assessment centres, daily conversations with people, role modelling of people having conversations like this, shift things significantly. Because for me, who found that a real struggle, it made me commit to doing some serious personal development, which is what I ask a lot of people to do if they've not got naturally high emotional intelligence. You've got to be seen to committing to developing yourself as a person, as a human being, if you're going to succeed as a leader. I think a lot of people have it naturally, and those people have it naturally are succeeding in our organisation, I think, in places where wellbeing is taken seriously. So I'm going to flip forward now to, if I can find the right button, the National Police Wellbeing Service. I always call this rhetoric to reality. Julie Ruston's in the room, who is leading on me for us on this nationally as the operational lead. I say rhetoric to reality because too many people talk about delivering wellbeing, but haven't got the facts together, haven't done the detail, and therefore overpromise to underdeliver, or don't walk the talk, which is fatal with wellbeing, because this, in our organisation, I'm going to explain, this is a really challenging agenda, very challenging agenda. These are the people who kick-started the wellbeing agenda. Ian Hesketh, who studied for his PhD with the guy on the bottom right, Professor Carrie Cooper. Professor Carrie Cooper is the grand fromage of wellbeing. He does a lot of commercial work, loves working with the police and blue light services. He does it for free because he says we experience the extremes of organisational emotional labour, as he calls it. This is a high emotional labour occupation. So people like Carrie Cooper are fascinated by how our people cope in terms of their well-being and their health in that environment. Linda Hindle, bottom left, is Public Health England, supported us originally to get going. In the middle is Dame Carol Black, who is the lead government advisor on all matters to do with health, and has really set her stall out to push this agenda along nationally in government policy. Ian and I went to meet her a couple of weeks ago, and she will endorse what we're doing, and I'm about to explain to you, as probably a good example of a sector-specific approach to wellbeing that's holistic, that covers everything from sort of tactical work right up to the strategic level. And Mike Cunningham, who's Chief Exec of the College of Policing, asked us to put a group together about 6 years ago when we were just running it as an NPCC portfolio, which are basically run with no money, no resource. It's a group of willing volunteers. That is now a different situation altogether. We have a £3 million annual cost a year to the National Wellbeing Service, Oscar Kilo, which I'll break down for you shortly. So I put guerrilla tactics up for Oscar Kilo because one of the things that we found is, and it was interesting listening to Michelle and Serena talk, is that if you try and sometimes deal with a system that doesn't want to accept something and play by the rules of the system, you never get anywhere. It becomes just a frustrating episode after episode of meetings, having to persuade dozens of people why this needs to do the right thing. And we have a head and heart approach to wellbeing in our team and the network of people we work with. We want people to do this because they think it's the right thing to do and they believe in it. And we should always have been doing it. But if we can't convince them of that, we convince them because our organisation as a business cannot run without the well-being of our staff being prioritised. And I'll talk about a bit more of that in the future. But guerrilla tactics are about, I think, in an organisational sense, the stakeholders for this are so complex to do national work, and actually they're very complex in your own organisation, that you've got to find ways to tap into the movement of people that really care passionately about this and get some momentum and commitment going in quite a viral way. And I think we've seen that across the country in certain pockets, particularly around staff networks, staff associations, and in certain pockets of your organisation, you'll find that you don't need to do a lot to get this sort of thing up and running as a cultural norm in a workplace. Some areas you'll find it really difficult. And I think one of the things that we've learned is how to negotiate a very difficult system, or else, quite frankly, we wouldn't have got anywhere. And the Oscar Kilo team, we deliberately do not present ourselves as an NPCC or a College of Policing gang of people, or a Home Office gang of people. We're there to support the service and the people who work in it to get this stuff world class. And sometimes that isn't helped by us presenting as a formal organisation. We try to work outside the system to influence it. So we basically got a small group, and then the Home Office, Amber Rudd, went to the Federation Conference 3 years ago and said, I'm giving you £7.5 million for a national welfare service. Unfortunately, they'd never come and spoken to us before they announced that, and we thought, what does that actually mean? And we're into the 3rd year of that money now. We've actually turned it into something really positive, and we have gone live with a national wellbeing service at the beginning of this year. That has taken a significant amount of work. We've got cast our net far and wide, whether it be the evidence base from people like Public Health England, learning from some of the stuff that the armed forces have done around psychological and mental health support, and also from Australian, Canadian and American law enforcement organisations. We have really good connections with those 3 countries, because whatever we're experiencing in terms of well-being, they're experiencing an extreme beyond it. Mainly because there's 2 reasons for this. They have an even more male-dominated culture, and they have a fully armed police service. And the levels of things like suicide are significantly higher in those countries than they are in this country, and the operational impact of getting this stuff wrong is far more severe. So we learn from each other, and we've learned tons. And I'll talk about, we've actually brought some of those people over to this country to lead some of our training, because they're experts in some of the things we want to do. So what do we want to achieve? This is a Public Health England mantra that we adopt. There are lots of really good things that can be done to support people's well-being, but can they be done affordably, at scale? Can they be done high quality, and can they be personalised? Because every single person in this room, your well-being is unique to you. There will be some things that are similar and consistent with other people who you work with, but everybody's lives are completely different. If I were to ask how many people in this room now are listening to me prattle on but thinking, there's other things that I'm thinking about. You know, have I become a carer? Have I got, you know, somebody ill in my family? Am I moving house? Have I got, you know, something happening at work I need to think about? Everybody's got unique things going on in their life, and that's what makes sheep dipping approach to well-being not a good way of approaching it. But it also makes it very challenging, particularly when we're talking about mental health and psychological well-being. And you'll see a lot of the things that I'm talking about do focus on psychological health and well-being, because it's the biggest area we've got to catch up on. I had a health and safety executive guy in my office the other day. I don't know who let him through the gate at headquarters, but he managed to find me. They track you down, people like that, you know, and I'm joking apart, this is a health and safety issue. The employer is responsible for this stuff. And he made the point that, you know, he talked about all this psychological stuff, Andy, but, you know, you've got double the levels of musculoskeletal injury in policing than the construction industry. And I said, well, yeah, but builders aren't fighting with, you know, each other over which spade to dig a hole with, are they, on a Friday afternoon? You know, our job involves conflict and violence, doesn't it? It involves physical labour. It's people putting themselves in harm's way. And I said, while we're at it, I said, they may have reduced in construction the amount of industrial accidents, absolutely dropped through the floor. But their biggest problem is male suicide. It is their biggest cause of death in construction industry is male suicide. So I said, they have not tackled the psychological issue anywhere near they've managed to tackle the physical harm issue in construction. So we're not alone in tackling this. Most people in their lives will experience 3 to 4 traumatic events, if they're unlucky. A police officer and some of our police staff will experience hundreds, several hundreds. They are the second highest traumatised occupation. This is research by Dr. Noor and Tirani, seconded only by aid workers in Syria and places like Syria. We're actually more highly traumatised in a consistent, permanent way than armed forces, because they tend to rotate out regularly. They experience severe trauma in intense tours of duty in theatre. But when you cut it over a lifetime, a length of career, our people don't rotate out of theatre as much. That's not to say this is a competition about who gets traumatised the most. What we're saying is that, you know, some of this research shows that as many as 1 in 5 of our police officers and staff are suffering from PTSD or complex PTSD, and 98% of them are still coming to work. So it's a hidden problem. And if you Google, don't do it now, but Google later the symptoms of complex PTSD and tell me whether you've experienced people in your workplace who are exhibiting those behaviours. People who become intensely fixated on something that you think is an organisational issue, and why is that? There is some really challenging work to do around that subject. So what do we want to achieve? So these are the 8 areas, and grab Julie later because she's an expert on this. This is up and running across the UK at the moment, England and Wales. Line management training, specific resilience training called the PERMA model. The National Wellbeing Service can train line managers and train trainers to train line managers in an evidence-based line management programme around resilience, which we have sourced, and there are training programmes going on, and there's already been some done across, I think, 21 forces have sent people to these so far. Trauma, post-in support and disaster management. This is a big piece of work for us. Ian's led on this. Julie has now got a training programme to deliver this in forces around what is it that we should be doing in those golden hours and thereafter serious major incidents and traumatic events. Our service is aiming to be able to be responsive, like MPOC is, to be able to get that support to the front end of a major incident so that people can have diffusing and debriefing. These are golden hours for people before they go end of tour, and we need to know what we need to do to support them that's evidence-based. And sometimes we think we're doing the right thing with people, but actually we're doing more harm than good. So that is a training programme that's signed off by Public Health England. Some of the people who are advising COBRA have signed this off, and we're going to be going around the country and training groups of people on that. We're providing 5,000 psychological screenings per year as part of the service. There are more screenings than that done across the country. They are the higher risk roles in policing, so 800 negotiators, road death investigators, indecent image viewing teams, CT teams that view violent imagery. We're providing the online screening, the assessment and the referral afterwards for 5,000. But as I say, there's a lot more screening that goes on. Individual resilience, training packages around this. We've currently said that for the uplift, we should be growing our organisations well, and for every new recruit that joins the police service from now on, they should all be provided with psychological resilience training as their initial training. It's actually included in PQF. I wasn't going to mention PQF, Elliot, but you know. So I thought that's good. So I said, what's actually in it? And I'd got an email this morning actually telling me what's in it. The slight conundrum I've got with this one is that when you read what's actually in the curriculum, it's not personal resilience, it's about dealing with the culture you're about to land in, which is part of your psychological resilience when you join the cops, I get that. But it's not what I would call personal resilience. But I think what we're going to try to do is work with providers who are doing this training and say, you need to turn that towards a very personal form of resilience for life, and establish those principles and those thinking skills with people before they even hit the streets, because there's a big opportunity there to improve how we do that. Executive leadership, we've run numerous executive leadership training sessions. The common theme is my boss isn't interested. You know, they talk about it, but they're not interested. We get people coming to executive leadership programs who are trying their best to deliver this in an organisation, but they have not got the top cover from their executive team. And if you're not doing this at the executive team and genuinely believing in it and making this not an afterthought, but something you put at the front of your decision making, then those people they're probably going to burn out themselves. Actually, it's quite a stressful experience for them because it is tough work, because it's cultural work within the organisation. Wellbeing at work. Julie and the team have been out and done some peer reviews already at 2 or 3 forces. We haven't got a lot of capacity to do peer reviews, but when we do go and do peer reviews, I think it's fair to say that every time we do it, I'm going to come to why this is at the moment, there is a different view of how well-being is going in the force at the executive level and the senior management level than there is at the front line. There's a yawning gap. And part of our job is to try to close that gap for people. It's the reality gap. Peer support, as I said before, we brought in an organisation called Badge of Life from Canada. We sourced them because we have Sergeant Belinda Mason. I don't think she's here today, is she, Belinda? No. Sergeant Belinda Mason from PSNI seconded to us. And she did a Churchill Fellowship, went all around the world looking at who's good at this stuff. And she sourced two big, really important pieces of work for us. One is around suicide prevention, which we're working with the Fed on. And the other one is around peer support. How to set a peer support model up safely, effectively in your organisation. We've brought them over from Canada and they've trained up, I think, 14 forces in Train the Trainer. And we have the ability to train every force and other organisations like the NCA, BTP, CNC in a safe peer support model. Peer support models are very commonplace. We've learned our lesson in my force that sometimes you can have too many people doing it. Those people who do it need to be trained and they need to be supported themselves. Or else, paradoxically, they will burn out. And they'll experience an emotional burnout, probably, because they're in a very difficult place in the organisation, often between the individual, professional standards, occupational health, the local management team, and that is quite a tricky place to operate in. And people need to know the boundaries and need to have the support of the executive team when they're doing that work. And the outreach service, we currently have 4 vehicles fully kitted up. Some of you may have seen these. There are 6,000 people already. These rotate around forces doing preventative health checks, physical and psychological. We have police mutual supporting us with this quite often, where they're doing financial health checks. And so far, rotating around the country, there have been 6,000 people plus been through those. I cannot tell you how important those vehicles are. We'll have a fleet of 10 soon, and we manage that fleet around the country. And most of the time, in what I call peacetime, they're doing preventative work. The Met has one just for themselves, and it is queued out all the time. They put it out with their provider. Because sometimes you've got to part these things outside the workplace. We have a very dynamic workforce, don't we? They're working shifts, they're working very dynamically, and we part this thing between where their building is and where their car is. And I've seen people walk past this, go and speak to people and score critical levels on psychological screening assessments. You know, people with a stab vest on the way to the job saying, I've considered taking my own life in the last 3 weeks. People with critical levels of blood pressure on the way to a job. And what you can do with these vehicles is you can get people referred very quickly and get people who probably would never have gone into occupational health and said, I think I'm struggling with mental health. This becomes the norm. It breaks barriers down. And the staff who work in the forces that are using them really well, are getting out into the workplace and breaking down some of those barriers around trust. In my force, we've gone from around 120 referrals a year in occupational health for psychological services. I think we tipped at 800 last year, referrals. And we have people asking for psychological services a lot earlier, and that is a good thing. But what that tells me is there's a huge unmet need out there, a huge unmet need, which is why we've got critical levels of probably traumatic stress, sometimes tipping into disorder in the organisation, because culturally we've never given people a confidence to say, I think I'm struggling at the moment. And if you've got good services to back them up, then you will be able to get those sorted. There's 2 projects on top of this. One is occupational health standards. They are coming, they're essential, because all this is generating extra demand for occupational health. And already some forces, occupational health services, queues are getting longer and longer. They have not got the capacity and capability to cope with this, particularly around psychological health. They'll be developed by early in the new year, and then we'll be working with forces to help them meet those standards. And the second one is trauma informing the NHS. So we've got the Royal College of GPs dropping an educational package into primary care, so that if a member of our policing family goes to see the GP, that GP will have been trained to understand their lived experience. Because it is very, very clear to us that a lot of our staff do go in through primary care, and those people do not understand the journey they've had before they got there. And it's really important those people who are treating our folk within the NHS understand the sort of things I've been talking about. So progress so far, this is the Fed survey. People have gone up, this is in a year on the Fed survey, encouraged to talk about mental health, 22 to 45%. This is where some of the demand and the unmet need is. I think millennials that are joining the job nowadays have no problem talking about mental health. They're very open about the mental health. They've got no stigma, as in my generation had. That is a good thing. Their expectations about the culture, the leadership and the services are extremely high. If I'm going to do this type of work, I need the right support. Line managers are confident to deal, but only 21% of them are trained, which is something that we're working on with forces, OcuHealth referrals and PTSD research. So we have the self-assessment framework, Oscar Kilos on the open internet. You don't need a password to get into it. You need a password to get into self-assessment. Every force in the country is on, I think, their third iteration, some forces, of their self-assessment. This is signed off by Public Health England. It's the thing that Julie and the team go out and peer review on the back of. We have the National Crime Agency, BTP, the Fire Service, all signed up to this self-assessment that is endorsed by Public Health England. This is the wellbeing vans, and I noticed actually, is anybody here from Humberside? Oh, aren't you? Anybody from Humberside? When you're over here, I saw that you had like good as grass AstroTurf out. It looked like Hickstead horse trials on your when you had the wellbeing van with a little white picket fence around it, and it looked like you needed gin and tonics. People really do. Forces are really going to town on this. Cheshire had it recently. You see pictures out there on Twitter. These are about walking the talk, folks. They are fully kitted out, these vehicles. We are getting those to the front end of serious incidents more and more now. The team managed to get some down to Thames Valley for that serious incident, and I think there are some down there today for the funeral as well. They're a visible representation that the organisation is out there and it cares about you, and we're going to provide you with the services. And the uptake is absolutely fantastic. This is the iceberg of ignorance. I'll wrap up shortly. This is what I'm talking about when I talk rhetoric to reality. Executives see 4% of what really goes on in the work. You can't convince people like me that that's the case. A lot of senior people get very upset about this. It's not that they're ignorant, it's that they think they know what's going on in the workplace when actually they don't, because they're not doing the work anymore. So staff engagement is vitally important when it comes to wellbeing, because you've got to listen to the people who are nearest the work rather than expecting all this stuff to arc around all the hierarchies and blockers and barriers you've got, because people don't like to tell executives bad news. And I don't think this is bad news. This is about not taking this stuff personally. It's about recognising that, you know, we take a pride in dealing with trauma in our organisations. I think we're world class at it. What we're not world class at is supporting our people who deal with that trauma day in, day out. And some of it is quite simple stuff. It's about how you treat people on a day-to-day basis. When you've got this multiple channels of staff engagement going on, what you'll find is that behaviours start to get checked, because people realise that people can find out if they are not walking the talk. If bad behaviours are creating stress in the workplace, then there are other channels of communication, and it is an open issue within the organisation. That will accelerate behavioural change. Very, very tough to do, and very, very tough agenda for senior people, particularly to lead on. Saw a piece of research the day around diversity and inclusion. I was listening to what Serena was saying, and it struck a chord with me, because it said, You know, actually the evidence is that diverse organisations, there's no evidence to say that their performance is better, because sometimes they don't bring inclusion with it. And inclusion, the problem you've got is that people don't know how to handle it. So you create a diverse team or a diverse workforce, but actually the people who work in that organisation can't handle it because it's really complicated for them, particularly if they're from the old culture. So that's why inclusion is a skill set for particularly line managers and senior leaders. And I have so many horror stories around well-being that are similar to Michelle and story about, when did you know you were pregnant? A year ago. Oh, really? That's clumsy conversations from people who just, whatever type of difference it is, they just, because they've not experienced it themselves, they cannot get their head around the language. And so they bumble around like a bull in a china shop, upsetting people. They're better off saying nothing sometimes, quite frankly. But this is why you can't turn well-being into a performance indicator, because certain people will think, well, it's about how many tick boxes I can hit today. How many well-being conversations have I had today? Tick, tick, tick. It's a human thing that people can spot a fraud in our organisation and mail off, can't they? Because we train people to spot frauds. And if people genuinely don't walk the talk with this and start living, eating and breathing it, they will show out very quickly. Executive workshops, we definitely want to reframe trauma, I think. Some of the research, I feel it could put people off joining the job, quite frankly. Whereas I look at trauma and think, well, that's our job. And to be able to support victims of crime and each other in their hour of need, if you are not looking after people's well-being in your own organisation, when they are walking up that garden path to knock on the front door, like many of us have done, they will not have any compassion left for the public because they've lost compassion for themselves and for their colleagues. There's a video of one of my police officers that 5 Live filmed when they came and did a programme on this a couple of years ago. She's a response officer in Blackburn, and they filmed her on a particularly miserable winter's morning in Blackburn when it was raining. It didn't, it looked depressing enough, to be honest, just looking at the footage. And she talked about, and you can get this still on if you YouTube it, PC Cora Lee. She talked about just not feeling okay after Fiona and Nicola were murdered. And I know we've got a charity out there today. She said it was just over the border. I got 12 years experience. I'm a female officer. I just felt not right, like I'd lost my confidence. I was anxious coming to work. It wasn't on my force, it wasn't far away. And I've seen a lot of bad things, but this event really affected me. And I was coming to work and I just did not feel confident. The thing that Cora did was she approached her line manager. First thing she did, actually, she had the self-awareness to realise that something wasn't right. Many people don't have that. They don't spot that in themselves because they haven't got self-awareness, which is the core asset you can have around your personal resilience, I think. But her line manager was very approachable. That's the tone he'd set with his team, and he was very well informed about what was on offer. And she talked about accessing services and getting back out there. I think if I showed you that video now, I showed it at SWIP actually, and I think you'd look in her eyes and think you are not okay. I think you'd look at her and you'd feel quite sad actually about the things that she was talking about, because she talks about emotionally shutting down at work, your personal life separate than your work life. There's this and there's that. I've got my game face. I get through it. That is her coping strategy, and there is nothing wrong with that. It's not unusual. But for the victim of crime and for her over time, that is quite a damaging mindset to adopt. Because, the victim of crime, the victims of crime, it's a massive, once sometimes a lifetime experience for them. And our staff need to retain the compassion. So the one thing I'd say to you folks, with all this stuff that's going on, can our people retain their compassion in the environment that they work in day in, day out? That is what we should be aiming for, because that is the thing that sets, I think, exceptional policing aside from average. So food for thought, trust and confidence, new expectation, particularly of millennials. I don't think many people are talking about millennials actually, despite the fact we think that in the next 3 years there's about 50-odd thousand of them joining the police. I'm a bit worried about this because when I see them, when they all join, I think, oh, they're all younger than my kids. And they ask some really tricky questions. I did a session with a load on day one. I said, when I say well-being, what do you think? They knew more than I did about it. You know, this is common language for a lot of people nowadays, you know. So, and I talk about the human fleet because, particularly with my colleagues, I have challenged them previously to say, how much do you know about your vehicle fleet compared to your human fleet? You will get, and you've been to our meetings, haven't you? You know, people love talking about cars and guns and stab vests and helicopters and dogs and things like this, you know. And they know an inordinate amount about their vehicle fleet, but they don't know anywhere near as much about their human fleet because they're not doing the work to understand those behavioural insights. And ultimately, and I'll wrap up now, this is about, I think the taser debate is a really interesting one. If I look at that from a well-being point of view, the first thing I ask myself is, what's bothering them? Why is it that our staff are even talking about, I want more taser, if that's indeed what they are saying? And it is because they are concerned about putting themselves in harm's way and not having the right kit, for whatever reason that might be, to be able to do it safely. And if you ignore that, then that is a huge public safety issue, because it is discretionary whether those people put themselves in harm's way. You cannot force those people to stop a vehicle at 3 o'clock in the morning with 2 or 3 people on board. They can decide to do it or not do it. And we rely on them to do it, don't we? And if you don't get some of this stuff right, and particularly listen to them and give them the support, whether that be psychological kit, resource, demand, whatever it might be, to do it, then they will withdraw that discretionary effort. And I think that we are seeing, in some elements of policing, for the first time, people withdrawing discretionary effort. And I speak to people who are working with people who say, well, I'm not staying on late today, or I'm not going to stop that car, you're joking. Why would I stop that car for at 3 in the morning? You know, I don't even know where I am. They've sent me to this area to patrol it without a sat-nav, and I don't even know where I am. So this is a huge issue. And I was talking to Michelle before, because she's our regional lead on ESN, the airwave replacement. That will will pale it into insignificance. If we do not switch on to the fact, that radio, what does it give you when you're out there on patrol? It's everything, isn't it? Makes you feel like, because it's true, there's a massive organisation behind it. If they lose confidence in that, if it's not right, and we'll make sure it's right, then that will be a massive issue. But it comes from having insights and listening to your people, rather than getting lost sometimes in the technical jargon around it all. So that's me. There's lots more you can have a look at on the Oscar Kilo site, or grab Julie if you want to know when some of these training courses and things are on, or you want the van wherever you work, and we'll give it you gladly. Thanks very much, folks. Yes. Yep. It's just reminding me, we've agreed at Chiefs Council, when was it now? A week before last, that Ian Hopkins, who's National Diversity Inclusion Lead, and myself on the Wellbeing, we've got a national survey that is going out. For the first time, we've done a national survey about Wellbeing, Diversity Inclusion. It will be going out through numerous channels for you to fill in, so please tell everybody to fill this in as much as you can. I think the end of October into November, and it'll be published early next year. It's the first time ever we've surveyed at a national level around these issues. The only other surveys that are done are either in force or with staff associations. But we have combined some of those surveys to put this one out. Anyone who's worked with Les Graham from Durham, he has constructed the question set. This is a really important survey, folks, so tell your friends, colleagues at work to fill it in. Yeah, it's going to come out from the lead for this, which is Ian. He's going to lead on the comms for it, Ian Hopkins. through MPCC and College of Policing. But I think the Met are going to go, anybody from the Met here? They're going to go slightly later with it just because their survey just collides with it at the back end of October. I think they may be 2 weeks later. But it's a really important survey to get a baseline on. It's going to be, the responses to this are not going to be published force by force in a league table because that would be a cultural disaster for policing. But forces can get their own, and it will be, the range of responses will be published and not anonymised. Okay.
So we've got a few moments for questions. So if there's a microphone going round, I've got Serena sat next to me as well. So if you've got any questions for either Andy or Serena, now's the time. Just raise your hand.
Don't be shy.
It was that good a briefing. You've got everything.
Come on, somebody ask me a question. Ask me a really tricky question. Come on.
I'll ask a question.
Great.
Jane Eaton, Merseyside Police. I really enjoyed that, thank you. I'm interested in your comments about we're a traumatised service, we've got a higher traumatised rate than first aid workers in Syria. Yeah. In terms of recruiting, because we've got the uplift fund, what direction do you think we need to take?
Well, I think there's two things for me around the trauma. I have spoken to people who've done that research. It was led by Dr. Jess Miller from Cambridge University. What's come on the back of it is some good training courses, actually, things like contact management and what have you. But what worries me is that there's quite a negative story around trauma.
Yeah.
I understand that, and it's negative if that impacts on you at a personal level, because it does, if it's not processed and it's not supported in the culture and leadership of the environment and the environment you work in. So what I'm trying to say around the new recruits is we need to be really bold and straightforward with them on the first day. Well, actually, what we do is we don't tell them about this on the glossy brochure, do we?
No.
You know, it wouldn't be very nice, actually, would it, to be showing them that? It's generally nice pictures, isn't it, that we entice people into the police with. And then, you know, the first time they experience something difficult can be a real shell shock for them. I think in their training, they need this up front and centre, but as a positive thing, this is what we do, and we're world class at it. And for you to become a world class professional at it, you need to take responsibility for your mental health. The organisation needs to support you to do that with having all those things around you, so you can thrive in this environment, not just survive. But there is a real narrative out there from some areas that we've just got to get through this stuff every day. I don't buy into it. I think it's negative, and it doesn't do the great people we have in our organisational justice. But the training course, if you go back to Merseyside, look at your provider for PQF, resilience training's in there, but break it down and go into the detail and say, what actually is it you're doing? Okay. Because I've done that today, and it's not what I think resilience training is. It sounds very much like you're going to enter a really horrible culture, how are you going to cope with it? Yeah. It's like, yeah, that's like going to make them even more stressed.
Hi, I'm Melissa from the City of London. I'm the Disaster Victim Identification Coordinator. Okay. And also police staff. So I was wondering, in relation to this particular project, is about considerations around both police officers and staff being given a training course when they come in about mitigating the impact of trauma, because you don't really know where the police forces are going, so therefore you don't know exactly what trauma staff and officers may be exposed to in these kind of heightened sort of environments that we live in. And particularly as somebody who went through the 2017 incidents, one after the other, is something that I think we should be looking at.
Definitely, and what I'd say is I think I had an email from somebody from the DVI network the other day about this particular issue. What we've said in the National Wellbeing Services, you know, when I talked about scalable but personalised, just within policing there's so many different roles that different. So, for example, Helen Ball came to me and said, right, can you provide screening for negotiators? Because it's a specific role you do on top of your day job with different needs. And we're providing screening for those. We've done the same with the CT network, and we are providing them the support to create quite a personalised model of care, for example, around people who view violent imagery. If the DVI network comes to us and says, and I had emails with Ian Hesketh about this over the weekend, we want something specific for the people who work in DVI, we've got the ability and the expertise to design that with you. And I think that's where we want to get to with this service. It's not sheep dipping in a vanilla service that suits everybody all the time. We've got to find ways to personalise this with the different roles that we've got in our organisation, because that separates you out from being, you know, one size fits all, to understanding the specific needs of people who, for example, I mean, similar to DVI, your CT or your ROCUs, they work in from different organisations. They need to know where they're getting the services from, who owns them. And when they go on mutual aid, I remember when some of ours went to Cumbria on the Derek Bird shootings, they were doing front-end stuff in terms of victim identification, FLO work. When they came back to Lancashire, nobody even picked them up. And so when they go on mutual aid, come back, it's like, you know, they're stuck between two places. So the call for us is, if you work in a specific area of the organisation and we can help you personalise something, that's what we're aiming to do as we move forward.
Thank you.
Yeah, we spoke to somebody in CT who'd spent 3 weeks, you know, viewing imagery every day for 10 hours for 3 weeks, horrendous imagery. And he said by the end of it, my head had gone. You need specific stuff to support people before, during and after that type of work.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Ruth from the National Crime Agency, and I guess I just kind of wanted to make a little bit of a point perhaps around the traditional versus the non-traditional. So I guess I'm a non-traditional policewoman, if you want to call it that. I've had powers, I've been an intel officer. I'm also a millennial. So it's a really interesting kind of thread that's going through the last few sessions. So I also don't have any children, and I guess it's a really interesting point around the retention and looking forward for the next 100 years, how you kind of keep people like me engaged in the police network if you're not doing an operational role. And I think it would be good in future perhaps to have, and obviously I don't know what's on the next few sessions, but I think if we could work a little bit more around the diversification of this wellness session or the wellness sessions, I think that would be really powerful to keep more people like me engaged on some of these things.
It's a really interesting point, that, because when we sit on Carrie Krupa's national group, he advises government, and he's got a cross-sector group of BP, the BBC, Serco, all these big organisations, and the reason that they're maxing out on wellbeing is around attraction and retention, because their turnover rates of particularly talented individuals are what hurts the business. Whereas I think in policing we've still got this sort of complacency that we've got a low turnover. You know, 4% I think is the average turnover rate of police officers, for example. It's higher in police staff in certain roles. But I think that's going to change. I think that's going to change with the new workforce. All the evidence suggests that people are going to want more flexibility. They're more likely to want to move around between different career options internally or move externally. And our hunt for talent should also be driving this agenda, because it's about being valued and given those professional opportunities as well, so you can thrive. But when I sit around the table and listen to them, that's why they're all doing it. It's a real commercial risk for them, because it costs them so much to attract talent, and it costs them so much if they don't retain them.
Okay. Thank you. If you show our appreciation for Chief Constable Andy Rhodes. Thank you.